Welcome to World Habitat Day 2009. My colleagues and I are honored to support this exciting gathering, the first time the United States hosts World Habitat Day. Thank you to the National Building Museum for lending us this historic hall. It really is a temple of the building arts. 16 American presidents celebrated inaugurations inside these magnificent Corinthian columns, a tradition reaching back to Grover Cleveland in 1885. But today, this museum that surrounds us doesn't only look back at triumphs of American public works and architecture, it also looks forward, showcasing intellectual blueprints for cleaner, greener, more inclusive metropolitan growth and urban renewal. We are joined today by several of the finest urban leaders in the world, and we will hear from a remarkable lineup of speakers in a moment. But first, some framing for today's event. As you know, our theme is planning our urban future. This theme reflects the inescapable fact of life that in the 21st century, life will be markedly more urban and much more interdependent. It represents the extraordinary opportunity for cities to become field laboratories for urban solutions, to grow more resiliently, more equitably, and more sustainably. And it sets a simple question in sharp relief. Will we shape the historic forces that are driving billions of people to cities and metro regions, or will we let these forces shape us? That the world finds itself in an urban age is now very well understood. You all know the numbers. The equivalent of 7 Seouls or Sao Paulos are added to the planet every year. The interconnected and accelerating forces of globalization and urbanization fuel a worldwide demographic revolution, pushing the majority of people into cities and metropolitan regions for the first time in history. This is no empty abstraction. It causes critical challenges, multiplying populations of slum dwellers, overburdening housing, transportation, and infrastructure systems, leaving millions dangerously exposed to environmental and health threats. But the dawn of this urban age also affords us singular opportunities. It is a moment for urban innovation, a time for new ideas, for new actions and ways of working together. You will hear from some of our speakers in a moment that the Obama administration is pursuing a robust sustainability agenda. And elsewhere around the world, innovation flourishes. Durban, South Africa, incorporates ongoing climate change assessments, adaptation, and mitigation into their long-term city planning. Stockholm, Dublin, Singapore, Brisbane are developing smart transportation systems, including congestion pricing, that reduce traffic and greenhouse gas emissions. In Shanghai, the world's first commercial magnetic levitation train shuttles passengers from the city's edge to its state-of-the-art airport at 287 miles an hour in 8 minutes. But together, we must do much more. And that means taking on some controversial questions. How do we break out of an old way of thinking, a 20th century way of thinking that pits rural interests against urban ones, blindly ignoring the fact that we don't only live in an interdependent world, but also in interconnected communities? How do we bridge policy and practice, ensuring that beneficiaries we try to reach have a voice in tailoring the interventions intended to help them help themselves? How do we move away from the idea that grave urban challenges such as housing and healthcare, energy and education, infrastructure and economic expansion exist in isolation? How do we rather address them holistically? To all of these, I'd suggest at least one common answer, and that is leadership. Leadership against the grain of misbegotten assumptions, against the entrenched status quo. Leadership to invest in cities and economic opportunity in those cities while promoting health and preventing further harm to our environment. My Rockefeller colleagues and I discovered that we had no choice but to change in our own efforts. For a generation, we worked domestically in the US in cities and globally in rural areas. The consensus held that in the United States, poverty was most pronounced in cities, and that around the world, it predominated in rural villages. That may have been true for a time, but not any longer. Poverty's face is both urban and rural. There are poor children in America's rural communities, just as there are in the housing projects of America's biggest cities. There are poor children in rapidly growing cities of developing countries, just as there are in the faraway furthest rural corners of East Africa and Southeast Asia. Moreover, as we know, rural problems are in partly creating the urban migrations, further pressing overtaxed cities. And it is increasingly apparent that the solutions to these problems, seeking opportunities, is coming from everywhere, not only from the experts, but from people and communities developing their own singular innovations. We are certainly not the first to understand this, but one of our Rockefeller Foundation heroines may have been. Let me share a story with you. Last summer, when President-to-be Obama campaigned in Ohio, a young mayoral candidate stood in the crowd, and he mounted a rousing defense of America's cities and towns. He said he supported the senator because cities needed a friend, not a foe, in the nation's capital. And then he offered the senator a gift. He called it the single most important book ever written about rebuilding cities. Before the guy had a chance to finish the statement, and without missing a beat, Senator Obama asked, "Is it Jane Jacobs?" Well, in October of 1959, a half a century ago next week, my Rockefeller Foundation predecessors approved the second of 2 grants to support Jane Jacobs' monograph in progress. For Jane, it was a somewhat frustrating project, but it evolved into what the young mayoral candidate called the single most important book ever written about rebuilding cities. For Jacobs, publication of the death and life of great American cities marked the beginning of an extraordinary career, committed to realizing the principle that since people who live in the communities often know what's right for them, they ought to have a voice in creating community plans and community policies. For the Rockefeller Foundation, collaboration with Jane Jacobs inspired 50 years of thinking about and working on urban issues, establishing the field of urban theory and design during the late 1950s, directing seed money to community-based development organizations during and after the urban crises of the 1960s and 1970s, swinging open the doors of affordable and supportive housing through the 1980s and 1990s, and mobilizing New Orleans' comprehensive, unified regional planning effort when Katrina's floodwaters receded, just to name a few. This half-century of experience guides our work today. Today, we inform public policies that help working families to access affordable transit options that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We help local officials harness the power of volunteerism and activism in cities across the country. We promote innovation in urban planning, finance, infrastructure, and governance. And we foster strategies and services to help those most impacted by climate change cope with its imminent and worsening effects. As we gather this morning, it is altogether fitting to invoke Jane Jacobs for the urban crises that are already here and those on the horizon. She once wrote that in order for a society to flourish, there must be a flourishing city at its core. And in order for a city to flourish, there must be active and engaged citizens at its core, dreamers and doers who embrace the notion that citizenship is only given meaning by the measure of our actions. As global citizens, as increasingly urban citizens, we face a choice. Either we watch as a deluge of billions surge into unplanned urban regions around the world, depleting the natural resources on which survival depends, fueling the spread of disease and possible pandemics, jeopardizing national security, or we lead by developing innovative, collaborative responses. Every community, urban and rural, has a stake in this outcome. And we must start with the recognition that none of us can master the 21st century's hard challenges alone. This insight is central to the Obama administration's foreign policy, and I am now delighted to introduce one of its architects, the brilliant Susan E. Rice, United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Rice worked at the White House or the State Department during all 8 years of the Clinton administration, focusing on problems posed by weak and failed states, on global poverty and transnational security threats. She held primary responsibility for making those 3 a.m. phone calls. Of Ambassador Rice, President Obama said this: "Susan knows the global challenges we face demand global institutions that work. She shares my belief that the UN is an indispensable and imperfect forum." But I think Secretary of State Madeleine Albright may actually have put it better. Susan, she said, is simply fearless. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Susan E. Rice.